Hello there, kia ora, and welcome to this week's episode of Behind the Walls, which you might notice isn't live. And if you joined us last week, you'll understand that it's because over the next 5 weeks, Blake and I are both incredibly busy with a whole bunch of stuff going on. In fact, this weekend I have 6 events to get to over 4 days. It's going to be a little hectic, and next week's interview is probably going to be me hiding in a corner, sucking my thumb while my hair falls out, rocking back and forth and crying. But I'll deal with that next week. This week, we've got a standalone interview for you with Shanan Halbert. Now, it is just me and Shanan one-on-one because Blake couldn't be there. He sends his apologies. He had a ophthalmologist, orthodontist, ornithological, something beginning with O. There was an appointment. I can't remember if it was birds or teeth or feet or eyes, but there was an appointment. Anyway, I digress. Shanan and I sit down and have a chat about some of the things that have happened towards the rainbow community over the last week, in particular the attack on the Te Atatū Community Centre and the message that sends about safety for our rangatahi and our rainbow communities and the actions that can be taken by people like Mark Mitchell, the police minister. We also talk about a whole bunch of other things, so please sit down and enjoy the interview itself. And if you haven't done so already, make sure you hit that like button or share button, subscribe to the channel so you can get updates on this as they come out. All right, I'm going to leave it now to earlier Paul and Shanan. So enjoy the show. Kia ora, Shanan. Thank you very much for joining me today. Much appreciated. Great to catch up with you again after we bumped into each other briefly on the weekend. It was a busy weekend for you in particular. You had the big day out, which is, how many hours were you on your feet for that?
I think I arrived to set up with the team at about 11 and went right through till the end at 7 p.m. But it was great, a wonderful turnout from all of our community and allies.
Now, the weekend made headlines for some wrong reasons as well. Destiny Church and their attack on the Te Atatū Community Centre and their presence at the Pride Parade that night. I'm kind of curious about what your view is on what happened and what should happen next.
Yeah, I think it's important for all of the public to understand that this is quite a significant community safety issue, and I've been holding the Minister for Police, Mark Mitchell, to account on this. What I'm really asking from him is if a mongrel mob member stormed a library, what would his actions be? And from the past year and 18 months, the government's talked a big game about being tough on crime and tough on gangs. But I'm not seeing the same application of effort when it comes to Destiny Church and their consistent attacks on the rainbow community. So whether that be about damage to property or pedestrian crossings, whether that be about standing outside, our kids going into school, protesting and intimidating them, whether it's about storming a public library or breaking down barricades at a public event, there should be quite severe consequences for this. We haven't heard much from Mark Mitchell, and that concerns me.
The responses that I know of that's come from the National Party, the Prime Minister said, it went too far, and then he hasn't really said much else. Mark Mitchell, I believe, said something fairly similar, right to protest is fine, but if you overstep that line, then obviously that's a bad thing. Have you heard anything from the other side of the House that has actually gone out and condemned these actions in a really forceful way?
I think between Labour, the Greens, Te Pāti Māori, strongly we have condemned these actions. Minister Mitchell did too. But the government actually has a responsibility here to keep our community safe. This isn't an isolated incident. It's consistently been happening for a couple of years now. And so it's really time that the government and the Minister for Police takes action over and beyond what the police are already doing. What does it actually take here to get some action out of this government when it comes to the rainbow community? And the responses like it went too far from the Prime Minister, thanks very much, but actually, what are you doing about it? The government promised that New Zealanders would feel safer under their watch. Is there an exception for our rainbow community? We don't feel safe. The people that are contacting me and that I talk to on the night do not feel safe. So what action is the government actually taking, Mark Mitchell, over and beyond what is in place now.
I know that there's a whole bunch of petitions doing the rounds at the moment. There's one there calling for to tangata and destiny-linked groups to be classified under the Gang Act. There's one to have them have their charitable trust status taken away. I've heard rumblings from the Greens that they're in discussions with intelligence services about ramping that right up and maybe putting it on like a terrorist list akin to what we've got with Proud Boys at the moment. What are some of the steps that Mark Mitchell could take next, or that the government could do next, to bring in actual ramifications for their actions?
Yeah, we have to work with what's in front of us, and the basic ask is the same for every New Zealander: is that they feel safe in our communities. We want Mark Mitchell to pay attention, to Destiny Church and their actions. In my view, they're patched up gang members. I want them treated exactly the same as the minister would respond to the mongrel mob or the black power. And for some of those resources to be allocated to addressing those issues in front of us. Mark Mitchell could include Destiny Church in the gang patch legislation if he wanted to. It would require legislative change, but he should have included them right from the start. He's got a real focus on gangs, but, to the rainbow community, Destiny Church is a gang.
In December last year, they added 2 new groups to that gang legislation that wasn't in the initial listing that they had, and that came as recommendations from the police to add them in. Have you had any feedback from the police about what happened, or what their views are on these potential changes?
Yeah, following the pedestrian crossing incidents that happened last year, I wrote to the minister raising my concerns around the safety of the rainbow community. He responded to me on that basis, outlined the things that are in place, and that he had confidence in the police to manage safer communities for us. That following month, which was August and September of last year, 119 incidents against the rainbow community were reported to New Zealand police. I've gone back to him this week in the House and said, of that 119, actually, how many are from Destiny Church and Brian Tamaki? He wasn't able to give me those numbers, so I have to follow up. I have to do the heavy lifting on this, because the minister, doesn't really see this as a priority. So, that's my commitment. I'm going to continue to hammer home for the minister. This is a serious concern. I don't believe the rainbow community is safe, and I don't think that we're doing everything that we possibly can in order to improve safety outcomes. Pride events are happening for the next 6 weeks. We launch into Pride in Wellington, Hamilton, and Christchurch in March. We want to ensure that Destiny isn't going to roll up and disrupt every single event. Pride is a celebration. It's an opportunity for the rainbow community to have its say, and we want to do it in a really positive light.
Actually, one of the questions that always crop up with this kind of cultural bullshit is, why do you need pride? For me personally, I can see that when you are dealing with this kind of bigotry and these kind of attitudes, pride is a celebration of people being who they are, and it's really important to celebrate that. I'm kind of curious what your perspective is on that. Why do we still need pride events?
Well, there's multiple reasons why pride is important. It's a coming together of our communities. It's celebrating the progress that we've made. If I go back to when Labor reformed, implemented homosexual law reform, when marriage equality came in, there's a history here. This month we celebrate banning conversion practices under our last government. But most of all, it's an opportunity to bring our communities together, no matter who you are, to build kotahitanga, to celebrate identity and culture. But there's also, economic arguments why pride's a great thing. There's lots of events happening around. It means that the city in Auckland is thriving. As an example, people are out and about. But the other part for me is that it's positive vibes. There's things as Aotearoa New Zealand that we've been incredibly progressive at, and we should celebrate that.
Speaking of the community itself, Auckland University was at the Big Gay Out, and they're currently doing a survey. It kind of highlights one of the areas where particularly gay men are still kind of put down in a little bit, like that they're held back a little bit around blood donation. Do you know anything about the process of that being changed so that gay men are able to donate blood? Because I know that there's works happening and that there is policy changing going on there.
Yes, we've long fought for the removal of discriminatory policies such as blood donation. We're seeing that change from Blood Donation New Zealand, and we should have an outcome there in April. They've signalled that those changes would be made. I had a crack at one of the National Party MPs, Carlos Chung, who in Select Committee suggested that that should go out for public consultation, whether people
Why?
wanted blood from people like us. Absolutely unreal. I'm pleased that the government actually has had some sense here and ignored that advice, because, we need more people donating blood. All people want to do that. We need to make that as easy as possible so that can happen. And there's good practices in place that test the quality of everyone's blood to ensure that it's safe for others to use when it's required.
Um, they're doing a survey at the moment. The process to get here has taken a while, to be fair. AUT instigated, it must have been almost 2 years ago, the first spot survey, which was finding out what the practices were for people that might be discriminated, the risks, and it was massive. They did blood tests, they did all sorts of things to get the data to go forward for this. They've just launched, I think, their second phase, and I'll make sure that there's a link in the description for anybody that wants to do that particular survey. Have you had a chance to sit down and look at any of those questions or get feedback from people who are involved in that process?
I have. I was at the Big Gay Out on Sunday, and I went to the tent and I did the survey myself. So it's good as a politician to see some of the implementation. You'll remember that Dr. Aisha Verrill was Minister of Health at the time. She implemented the investment into the spot survey, and the data that it's producing for us actually gives us a much more realistic picture of what support is required for our rainbow community and broader New Zealand. So to have the second round, I think that's a really positive thing. I remember us launching it at AUT, and to do it myself gave me a different insight as a user around some of the questions that are being asked. Some of them are really personal, but most of all, I think it's important for people to know that they are anonymous. But accuracy of data is really important to inform some of the services, the funding and resources that are allocated to supporting our community's needs.
One of the researchers there also mentioned to me that part of the process for bringing this in and bringing this change in is actually retraining, because it's been years, like it's decades of the same policy, and a shift in policy takes time to retrain people in. Have you come across any issues like that around policy changes, for example, with the government, or any issues that you've come across where everything just seems so kind of entrenched because it's been that way all the time? So change is a little bit more difficult to come across, or a little bit more difficult to get rolled out?
It's been difficult for decades, and I know and when we were government over the 5 years, we did as much as we could to push a progressive agenda and ensure that everyone had equitable healthcare access. My focus in opposition this round is to ensure that the government is keeping the things in place that are there to support our rainbow community. Sadly, they've pulled back on the relationship guidelines in schools. That's really concerning. The minister promised that she would replace them with something based on the report findings. That hasn't happened yet. The one that is on my watch list that I'm very concerned about is how we can retain access to our rangatahi having available puberty blockers. I'm comfortable with the practices that are currently in place. You've got incredible healthcare teams that are supporting people around these decisions. You've got good whānau support, mental health and wellbeing services available through interdisciplinary practices. We've got to retain those. That decision will be coming up very shortly to Cabinet. Cabinet will be making those decisions. That worries me because that puts that directly in a political environment versus really taking advice from experts in the field. So that's one to watch, but I'm worried.
REC is a big one for me because I've seen the work that went into it, and that incredibly woke MP Judith Collins launched it. It must be about a decade ago, and we've seen some really positive changes from it. In the House, the rhetoric from organisations like New Zealand First, for example, around RSC is scary. For me, I find it really kind of horrifying. How do you combat that in both the House and the public sphere when you've got disinformation coming out from somebody who's in, a deputy prime minister's party is spreading this kind of disinformation that puts people in harm's way?
Well, it's real. You saw this week when I was asking questions on behalf of our rainbow community to Mark Mitchell. Winston Peters stood up and intervened on a very, ridiculous point of order that was unnecessary. Hana Rafiti was doing a speech yesterday advocating and supporting our Takatapui whānau. We saw David Seymour disrupt her speech, accusing her of reading her speech notes, which is something that we do as a daily practice in Parliament. That these minor parties are ridiculous at times. They're getting a lot of airtime for issues that really impact on our rainbow community. So I'm looking to national, and that's why I focus on the National Party members and their government, who also came to the Rainbow Parade on Saturday night. If they genuinely believe in our rainbow community, then I actually want them to start standing up against their minor parties. Erica Stanford on the RECs. Chris Bishop has always been a good advocate of the rainbow community, but has allowed our trans women in sport to take a back seat because of New Zealand First.
I'm going to correct you on that one, actually. That changed that because he initially went to Sports NZ and said, "What's your policy guideline?" And they came back and said, case by case basis, sport by sport. And it was National Party supporters that demanded he go back and change. It wasn't New Zealand First the second time.
Sure. And then we move into Matt Ducey, and not providing any mental health funding to outline. So, there's just a range of issues where you just can't trust this government. But out of anyone, I do look to some of the previous advocates from the National Party to really stand up, take some responsibility. But the attacks this week aren't necessarily on the rainbow community only. They've gifted that love into migrants, and so they give the boot to beneficiaries, give the boot to people with disabilities, they give the boot to the rainbow community, and now they're giving the boot to migrants.
Yeah, it's been pretty tough to watch. I saw this week Winston and Shane Jones doing their whole anti-immigrant thing again towards Ricardo Menendez March. Is there a mood in the House when that kind of thing happens? When your comments are just like, whoa, this is a bit too far? How do people react to that?
Yeah, you would have seen a couple of points of order come up when those issues arose in the House. A lot of it's about media headlines rather than the realities and important things that New Zealanders want the government to get on with. That's how they're competing for attention, who can say the most outrageous things, I think, to get that media hit. And this is where I guess the lack of leadership from the Prime Minister himself, not being able to manage his coalition partners, becomes incredibly problematic. So we do need to see some leadership from the Prime Minister. He's coming across as very weak on the major issues in front of New Zealand. We still just haven't seen any real cost of living relief that the government promised. I come back to law and order, that they promised that New Zealanders would feel safer. Our rainbow community doesn't.
Speaking of communities, you're the spokesperson for Auckland issues at the moment. Wednesday, there was an announcement from Wayne Brown that he's going to be seeking re-election. Karen Leone's also announced that she's going to be running, the Faux Ward councillor. For you, what sort of issues do you see as being the big ones for people of Tamaki going into this year's local body election?
Yeah, I just want to wish both Wayne and Kieran well on the campaign. I love Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland. I always talk about, the opportunity that our city presents. And like many, I came to Auckland for that opportunity to study and then to work and then get ahead in life. It's a vibrant city, but the cost of living challenges are real for Aucklanders. We're seeing rents go up. We're seeing people not being able to afford the basics. We're seeing increased poverty. And, one of the stats that Helen Robinson from Auckland City Mission commonly speaks about is that 1 in 4 of our tamariki are going hungry on a daily basis. So, we need to respond to some of that. We can absolutely sort of just focus on how the city runs economically. But if that's not touching our most vulnerable in our city, then something's wrong. So turning our political attention to that, I think, will be a good discussion piece for anyone in the race for local body this year.
You and Carmel are going to be running some sort of public meetings, some sort of discussions with the public around a few of these issues. Do you think it's a good idea for these people who might be considering running, whether it's for mayor or for council or for the local boards, to come and have a chat to you guys and find out from your perspective what the feedback is, or is there any sort of advice that you could give them to learn a little bit more about what they might be signing up for?
Yeah, always, we're always on the lookout for good progressive people to stand and represent their communities. And, that democracy is really important. Carmel and I are running a public meeting next week on social development and child poverty, and particularly from an Auckland context. The thing for anyone standing is that they've got to understand, I guess, the detail that sits behind our current situation, what past governments, both local and central, have done to create change, sometimes for the better and sometimes not. When they're developing their own ideas and policies over the next few months to pitch to our Auckland community, does it actually make sense? Does it hinder people? Does it actually create the opportunity for Aucklanders that we want to see? So, we're really open to having that kōrero with individuals and with groups. So it's a good chance to come along on Thursday night too. I can drop the details below.
Yeah, we'll put the link in the description as well so people can track that one down. Auckland Council this week gave a presentation to the Justice Select Committee around the Treaty Principles Bill. Auckland is a really interesting place because there are so many iwi up here. It is such a large area. From your perspective, how does the Treaty Principles Bill impact those relationships with iwi within the Tamaki Makaurau area?
I think it takes us backwards a couple of decades. The amount of work that's been done by local and central government to strengthen relationships with iwi and urban Māori partners, we've taken a number of steps forward by just going through the treaty principles process to date, which effectively is into second reading. It's broken down that trust. And no politicians are immune from that, because in the eyes of many Māori, we're all one and the same. So it makes it very difficult. And that also has a ripple effect. If we have low trust, that has a ripple effect on how people participate in our democratic system in the future. They think, none of these people are going to represent me well, so potentially I won't vote. I hope it goes the opposite way, that it increases the overall number of people, particularly Māori, that vote in our local body elections and in central body government elections in 2026. It's really important. There's so many concerns out there, and so we've just got to tweak who leads us forward, and so leadership is important in this sense.
Speaking of local body elections, those are October, I want to say 7th. Sometime in October this year. Postal ballot again. There's been a lot of noise out of Conservative councillors in places like Tauranga, I think it was Tauranga, Kirikiriroa, Hamilton, about spending extra money to get people out there to vote. by having voting booths at, say, supermarkets, for example, instead of just council-owned facilities. Auckland doesn't have on the ballot this year the poll or the referendum on Māori wards because we don't have them here. Have you had any feedback from anybody around how that might impact local body turnout in other parts of the country?
Well, that was one of the most disappointing decisions that I've seen from Auckland Council, that we weren't able to implement Māori wards in our biggest city, Tamaki Makaurau. I haven't seen it as yet how that's going to roll out across the country. But again, at the moment, we just can't take anything for granted under this government. People need to show up. They need to demonstrate how important Māori representation is in our local communities. And, we're playing a different game where we can't expect that they're going to be retained. This government openly campaigned to end and repeal Māori wards. They've done that, and we've got to ensure that we push back, we get the numbers in place, and we put those Māori wards in place for the future permanently.
One last question for you. There's a really real feeling of fatigue in some people that I've spoken to about just everything that's happening. The first 100 days, for example, set the record for the number of acts put through under urgency in Parliament. It just feels like a constant onslaught, that juggling for media attention that you mentioned with a whole bunch of sort of sniping and culture war bullshit. What sort of advice do you have to people out there to try and combat that fatigue? Because we're sort of almost halfway through the election cycle for the general elections. Is there anything people can do to sort of regroup and re-energize themselves?
Yeah, well, I hope that a lot of people have had a good holiday, over Christmas and New Year's. I know for me that coming out of last year, I needed to reset. I found the end of last year incredibly heavy and toxic, and I needed to strategize in my own head how I was going to approach the issues that confront us this year. And part of that for me personally was that I take the Māori issues quite personally. And struggle to separate them out from the job that I'm doing politically in Parliament. And so I've worked through for myself some strategies there. But for everyone else, and for me as well, is finding hope that I do believe that we can change this government and for current government to be a one-termer. I absolutely believe that. And if people can find their own hope through their whānau, then the next step for them is to get involved. Find politically where you sit, start to organise in your own communities. But if we don't start soon, then that will make it much harder to make this a one-term government. So now is the time, and just encourage all of our whānau, let's set this up, let's move this government on and put a government in place that's going to represent what we need for our future generations.
Perfect place to finish up on. Thank you very much for joining me, Shanan. Hopefully it's not too wet and wild and windy down in Wellington at the moment.
The sun's out. Thanks very much.
Hey, thanks again for checking out this interview for Behind the Walls. We're going to make sure that these regular ones coming out over the next 5 weeks so you're not completely bereft of content. We know how much people get excited about politics. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed it. Feel free to give it a like or to comment down below and tell us what your thoughts were on the process. But don't forget, I've got filters on really, really high for hate speech, and I will block people for that. So don't do that, I guess. Anyway, until next week, live long, prosper, be one with the force, and I will catch you all later. Hey, thanks for checking out today's video. Make sure you like, share, subscribe so you get more updates as we go along. We deal with these guys for the rest of the year.